Okay, welcome back into my Winter of Manga 2024 recap. This time we're going to be talking about 5 manga that I have read volume 1 of and may or may not continue reading. First up, we got a new manga called After God. As I'm recording this, there is only 1 volume out. More will probably be coming soon. But yeah, this one just kind of had an eye-catching cover. I had never heard of the series, never heard of the artist, and you know, I just thought I would give it a try. And it is pretty cool. I will probably read more of this one. The premise, it's a little hard to explain, but it's basically like one day these gigantic humanoid entities showed up all over the earth, calling themselves gods, and there are just all sorts of odd things about them. It seems like they caused a sort of like semi-apocalypse when they came. But yeah, there's all kinds of odd things that the story tells you about them, like they don't show up in video recordings or photos, and anybody who looks them in the eye turns into water and disappears. But also a lot of people are like strangely compelled to approach them like for that express purpose for some reason. Now, to some extent, there are characters in this manga that have supernatural powers. I don't know if those are all derived from these gods, or if there are other sci-fi or fantasy elements bringing them in. But one of the main characters is this girl who has eyes that look like a god's, and she is able to draw some kind of mysterious power from that. A lot of Volume 1 has to do with her kind of being brought in by the authorities who are studying her and kind of trying to figure out the nature of these powers. But she is mad at the gods and she wants to destroy them because they led to the death of her friend. There's also a wacky talking animal mascot character for some reason. This, like, weird little cat character who is just full of wisecracks. So that's a little odd. There was also this one panel where I could not figure out if this character was supposed to be eating a giant gyoza or if she's just holding a calzone in her chopsticks. Anyway, I am pretty intrigued by After God. I'll probably give it another volume or 2 at least, because it's got like pretty well composed and interesting gruesome action scenes. A little bit of body horror going on too, but I don't know, it just kind of sets up some cool mysteries, so I'm wishing this one success. Next up, I don't know where else I'm gonna fit this into the video, but I bought a huge JoJo art book recently. This came out in Japan about 20 years ago, but we finally got it in the US. I don't know what took them so freaking long, but I bought that and that's cool. Anyway, I bring up that illustration book because I saw something odd come into the manga cafe one day, which is JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Crazy Diamond's Demonic Heartbreak, which I had never heard of in my life somehow, and I'm like the #1 JoJo fan. The localization, of course, calls it Shining Diamond's Demonic Heartbreak, but this basically is, I guess, like, made by a couple of JoJo fans. I know that the artist also made No Gun's Life, which I have not read, but I did watch the anime for, and I liked that pretty well. Basically, I have now done a little research on this, and I know it's 3 volumes long. So far I've only read volume 1, and it's basically about a story that takes place between part 3 and part 4 of JoJo, where Whole Horse goes to Morio and meets up with Josuke. And also Kakyoin's cousin is there in Morio, and kinda wants to figure out what happened to him. I don't know why she thinks she's gonna find the clues in Morio, maybe that's where he lived. Anyway, part of it has to do with, like, Whole Horse trying to find this bird stand user. I think it's another falcon, like Pet Shop, except this one is named Pet Sounds. And Boingo is also along for the ride. from Part 3. And a thing I have to bring up is they use some of the changed names. Okay, like Crazy Diamond is called Shining Diamond for some reason, but the Viz manga localization had changed Oingo and Boingo to Zenyatta and Mondada, which I always thought was really stupid because they just changed one music reference into another music reference. But in Shining Diamond's Demonic Heartbreak, Boingo is called Boingo. They didn't change his name for this one. Why is that? What is going on? But also, there was a very minor character in Part 3 named Kenny G, and his name is changed to Billie Jean. Once again, they're changing one music reference into another music reference. What is the point of this? Somebody at Viz, please tell me what goes into your decision-making process for all these obnoxious name changes. Anyway, since this one is only 3 volumes long, I will probably read the entire thing. I'm just waiting for more of that to come out. It's pretty good. Now, I forgot to grab this one before I started recording, but I bought Volume 1 of the long-awaited Kagurabachi. I didn't know much about this series until Volume 1 came to the Manga Cafe. All I know is that as soon as Chapter 1 dropped, it was like an instant viral sensation. So, I didn't feel that driven to read it. I thought, based on all of the kind of screen caps I had seen of it, I was like, this looks decent. It doesn't look like something life-changing. But, I decided to give it an honest try. I read Volume 1. Main reason I bought Volume 1 was because I figured it would get snatched up really quickly, and I wanted to have a copy from the first printing because I'm kind of a collector. And, I figured, even if it's not a series I end up loving, it'll be a neat little time capsule of pop culture history years down the road. But yeah, I read Volume 1, and it's pretty good. I'll probably read more of this. There's no way this one is not going to get an anime, and I'll probably watch that whenever it comes out. Something about this artist's style reminds me a lot of One Piece, particularly the way he draws female characters. I feel like the way he draws girls is very similar to the way Oda draws girls. So I might look this up at some point in the editing process and see if maybe this artist used to work as an assistant to Oda. It would not surprise me in the least. In fact, I'd probably be more surprised to learn that he never worked as an assistant on One Piece. I will put the results of my research on screen here about how either correct and wise I am, or about what an incorrect fool I am. Anyway, Kagurabachi is a pretty interesting story. The main character is this teenager who grew up with his dad, who worked as a blacksmith forging katanas. I kind of think this is set in like an alternate history, because there's mention of his father's katanas being used in a war, and I was like, at first I was trying to figure out, is this set like sometime in the distant past? But then there are chapters, where people are like driving cars and using cell phones, so I'm like, okay, well, it seems to be set in the 21st century. It probably is modern times. So I'm like, what war is this that they're referring to? But yeah, I think it's a kind of like alternate history kind of thing, because there are definitely like magical powers in the world. There are sorcerers. This is like well-known information. And the main character's father was known for making these sort of enchanted swords. And, to kick off the premise of the manga, within Chapter 1, he's been killed and his magical swords have been stolen. And it's up to the main character now to hunt down the 6 stolen magical swords, using his own magical sword. Anyway, I don't know if I've mentioned this in the past, but I am kind of a sucker for action series plotlines that set up like this, like where it establishes, okay, there's exactly 6 of these swords that need to be found, or like, oh, there's exactly 8 evil generals that you need to defeat, or whatever the case might be. For whatever reason, I always like it when they set up like a defined number of objectives, because you're kind of like counting down throughout the series, and you know that like the final one is going to be the most interesting. Although, you know, maybe a premise like Komi wants to make 100 friends isn't the most like sustainable way to build hype for the plot to come. But Kagurabachi and its 6 magical swords, you know, I'm here for it. It seems pretty cool. Hype is already pretty high for Kagurabachi, and I feel like it's gonna be through the roof whenever it gets an anime adaptation. So if you're like me and you're aware of the hype, but you're like, well, should I get on board with it? My answer is, yeah, I guess so. Pretty good. Go for it, sure. I'm sure I've mentioned offhandedly many times how I'm not a very big fan of Isekai. And if you've never heard me say this before, I'm not a very big fan of Isekai. I feel like most of it is just escapist fantasy of, hey, what if I got reincarnated in another world, except everything was great? And once in a while you get your rare Isekai where it's like, it seems like, oh, what if I got reincarnated in the other world and everything was great, but actually it sucked. So subversive. Once in a while I can get into a good Isekai parody, which is a nice segue for me to bring up the fact that I started collecting Uncle from Another World very recently, and shortly before recording this video, I actually caught up collecting every volume that's out right now, which numbers up to 10. I have not yet read most of these, so I won't be talking much about this series. I read like 2 or 3 volumes in the past, and eventually I decided, you know, I really like this series, I should collect it. So shortly I will start reading the rest of the volumes now that I've actually bought them. But yeah, I like that series because it is kind of a parody of Isekai. You know, the guy who got Isekai'd, he wasn't aware of things like what a tsundere character is, and so when he encounters such a character in the other world, he just kind of thinks she's an asshole. And, you know, there's the trope of Isekai protagonists getting by in the fantasy world because it has the same magic mechanics as their favorite video game that they played for 18 hours a day. Probably why they hated their fucking life and wanted to get isekai'd. But in Uncle from Another World, all of his video game knowledge comes from games on like the Sega Genesis and Sega Saturn, so his knowledge doesn't really help him much. But he tries his damnedest to use it anyway. Anyway, the whole reason I brought up Uncle from Another World and Isekai in general was to say that I broke my rule and I decided to pick up an Isekai series, this being Killer Shark in Another World. Now, the title of this manga might be a little misleading, and in fact my calling it an Isekai might be a little misleading. Now, keep in mind I've only read volume 1, so just a few chapters, but this one turned out to not really be an isekai. Like, not entirely. It's not about a character from our world getting reincarnated into a fantasy world. It's just set in a fantasy world from the beginning. There's probably going to be a little bit of, like, magical trickery relating to our real world, but it wasn't really made clear in Volume 1. The premise is basically... Admittedly, I have not watched or read a ton of isekai, I'm just kind of familiar with the tropes, and I know one of them is the weakest but actually the strongest, and that's kind of what this manga is. It's about a little girl who lives in a world where there are lots of summoners, you know, like wizards who summon familiars to fight for them, and she's always been the weakest summoner, but then one day, she gets this weird flash of inspiration, and she is now able to summon the level 600 something whatever Killer Shark, or as it's called in the manga, Shark Killer, which is pretty great. I honestly kind of love the name Shark Killer. It actually stands for something, and I hope I remembered to take a photo of the manga explaining what that, like, stood for. If I did, I'll put it on the screen right now. Anyway, it caught my eye because I was like, well, maybe this will be another fun isekai parody, but it doesn't really seem like something I'm gonna stick with. I'm probably gonna not read Volume 2 and beyond. Volume 2 has been out for a while, in fact, and I have not touched it. It's just like, I don't know, it was a fun-ish premise to start with, but every chapter is pretty much the same thing, where the girl encounters a powerful enemy, and they are like, I am so powerful, there is no way a puny human like you can ever defeat me, and then she summons the shark, and it easily defeats the enemy. That's about it. That's every chapter. The only kind of variation on it is it kind of like turns into different types of shark monsters. Like it turns into a 3-headed sharktopus, and it turns into a sharknado, and at the end of Volume 1 I now feel like I have seen all of the tricks in the bag. One odd thing about this manga that I actually kind of like is that, like, every single character except for the main character is a huge asshole. They're just, like, completely irredeemable people. Like, both the demons and all of the humans that she encounters. She ends up with a little fairy sidekick, and the fairy is also a big asshole. There's a lot of cursing in the translation, which, you know, it's odd, but I don't hate it. Once in a while, it's kind of nice to see that "fuck you, Sasuke" school of fan-subbing or translating. But yeah, I mean, another kind of problem with Killer Shark in Another World is it kind of uses the isekai habit of, like, you know, using video game shorthand, which I think is a problem in a lot of fantasy manga in general. Like, I talked about in Frieren, I think, how the characters would talk about, oh, maybe we should get a thief to join our party. And in reality, nobody would ever say such a thing, because you're like, why would you want to hire a thief? We don't need to rob anyone. They might just rob us. But if you've played RPGs, you understand that, like, oh, in Dragon Quest or in Wizardry, if you have a thief in your party, they disarm treasure chests that have traps in them. Like, the word thief is video game shorthand for character who can disarm traps in dungeons. Or, you know, characters talk about their reserves of mana, and I'm like, do they feel no need to explain to the reader how mana works? I guess we're just supposed to understand it as an invisible blue bar that each character has that drains when they use magic and gradually fills up over time, or when they drink a mana potion. Killer Shark kind of has some of that video game shorthand because, like, monsters are shown to have a level, you know, like an experience level. And, you know, you're just supposed to understand, as somebody who has probably played a video game with RPG mechanics in it, what a level is. Never mind, like, how a creature gains levels, or how these levels can be read by people. That's just how you know which character is stronger. I just think it's kind of sloppy writing. Anyway, that was kind of my fun jaunt into an isekai that wasn't exactly an isekai. And I'm done with that. My next one is something a little more intriguing. And it's kind of funny that I bring this up after Killer Shark, because this one is kind of a reverse isekai, in a way. This is called Thunder 3, and this is really kind of an oddball manga. I don't know if I've ever read anything exactly like it. It's kind of about these characters who look like they're in this simplistic, cartoony, retro-style manga. You know, kind of a slice of life, school life story. It's kind of weird because, I don't know, it has these weird kind of anachronisms, because sometimes the characters are talking about Super Famicom games they want to play, and other times they're talking about PlayStation 5 games they want to play. And I mean, sure, both of those things exist in the world. Maybe these are just kids who are fans of retro games and modern games. I don't know. Anyway, they one day encounter this DVD which like shows them footage of our real world, and they end up climbing through the screen and going into the real world, because the main character's little sister went through first, and they have to go through and try to find her and rescue her. But, as it turns out, in the real world, the Earth has been invaded and kind of taken over by these giant aliens. But also, as it turns out, these cartoony manga characters who come into the real world also seem to have superpowers. Like, they're basically indestructible, and they can jump super high and punch super hard. And so far, the story has been about them finding their, like, real-world counterparts and kind of beseeching them for help in tracking down the little sister. The reason this one is so intriguing to me is there's been a lot of speculation online that this manga is made by the creator of Gantz, but written under a pen name. And man, it really looks like his art style, like to a T. I had somebody on Twitter mention to me that maybe it was being done by a former assistant of his and not by the man himself, because apparently in the later parts of Gantz, it was largely being drawn by assistants, so maybe they learned to mimic his art style really well. And that's definitely a possibility, but man, they really nailed it in every step of the creation process, if so. I'm personally more in the camp of it's him making Thunder 3 under a pen name, maybe to distance himself from the giantess fetish porn that he started making after Gantz. Because so far the only element Thunder 3 doesn't have is, like, gratuitous nudity and sex. And it's also not as gory or violent. Yet. But just so many elements of it, like not just in the art style, but in some of the storytelling, is very Gantz. Like the fact that a lot of the backgrounds are just photos taken with filters applied to them. And just the way the more realistic characters are drawn is so much his style. And also the way every, like, random passerby pedestrian on the street is basically a blithering idiot. You know, they see these, like, cartoony manga characters walking by, and they're like, whoa, look, these guys look like they're from out of a manga or an anime. What is this, some kind of cool special effect? Oh, weird, shoot a video of it and put it on TikTok. You know, everybody just acting like complete morons. Everybody who isn't a main character being just a complete dunce. It has that sort of contempt for the general public that Gantz also had. You know, how people would see, you know, a crowd in front of them getting slaughtered by aliens and just be like, whoa, cool, they must be shooting a sci-fi movie over there. So I want some other people to give Thunder 3 a read, at least for a little while, and tell me what you think. Do you think it's Hiroya Oku operating under a pen name, or do you think it's just an assistant of his who got really good at imitating his exact art style and narrative style? Also, I don't think I mentioned my ranking. This is like a modestly high priority. Not very high, but I would probably read another volume or two and see where it goes. And so that marks the end of my single volume sample pack. Join me next time for... Let me insert a generous gap there in case I decide to edit this in a different order. Manga that I finished this winter. Thanks for watching, everyone. And extra special thanks to the financial supporters of the Manga Cafe listed here. We have an audience question this time. This comes from Pocket Sand, who asks, a bit unrelated to the Manga Cafe, but have you tried Ellen, and if you did, how is it when compared to Ilona Plus? By the way, it's totally fine if any audience questions are not at all related to the Manga Cafe, so feel free to ask whatever. My answer is going to be a little anticlimactic though, because I have not yet tried the new game by the Ilona developer. Basically, I just haven't really had the time to get around to it. Back when I was posting the Ilona tutorials and stuff on my channel, I think I was only working part-time back then. So now that I am working full-time, I have a lot less time for video editing, which is why I lean more towards things like the Manga Cafe, which are a little less involved. But, well, thanks for the audience question anyway. Anybody else who wants to ask me anything at all, just do so in a comment down below and I will bring it up in the next video. See you then.